Genesis chapter 18 verse 1. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. Genesis chapter 18 verse 1 marks the beginning of an important event in the life of Abraham. To understand its significance, let's delve into the context and explore the implications of this verse. Abraham, originally known as Abram, is one of the prominent figures in the Bible. He is considered the patriarch of the Israelite people and is renowned for his faith and obedience to God. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abram to leave his homeland and promises to bless him and make him a great nation. Throughout his journey, Abraham encounters various trials and tests of faith, but he remains steadfast. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 1, we find Abraham encamped in the plains of Mamre, which is believed to be near the ancient city of Hebron. The appearance of the Lord in this verse is a significant event. It signifies a divine visitation, where God himself chooses to reveal himself to Abraham in a visible and tangible form. The setting of this encounter is notable as well. Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. This detail emphasizes Abraham's hospitality and his willingness to receive guests, even in uncomfortable conditions. In ancient Near Eastern culture, offering hospitality to strangers was a highly regarded virtue, and it reflected the generosity and openness of the host. In the subsequent verses, we learn that three men appear to Abraham. These visitors are traditionally understood as angelic beings, and one of them is identified as the Lord himself. Abraham recognizes the significance of these guests and hastens to extend his hospitality to them. He prepares a meal for them, which includes bread, meat, and milk, and serves it to them under the tree while they rest. This encounter holds profound theological implications. It reveals God's personal interaction with human beings and his interest in their lives. The Lord's visitation to Abraham demonstrates his faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. Throughout Abraham's journey, God had promised him descendants as numerous as the stars, and now, in this encounter, God reaffirms that promise. The visitors inform Abraham that his wife, Sarah, will bear a son within a year, even though both Abraham and Sarah are advanced in age. Genesis chapter 18 verse 1 serves as a reminder that God often chooses to reveal himself to his people in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. It underscores the importance of hospitality, as Abraham's willingness to receive these visitors leads to a significant revelation and blessing. Furthermore, this passage foreshadows the birth of Isaac, who becomes a crucial figure in the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 1 marks a pivotal moment in Abraham's life, where the Lord appears to him in the plains of Mamre. This divine visitation highlights God's faithfulness, his personal engagement with his people, and the importance of hospitality. It also sets the stage for the fulfillment of God's promises and the birth of Isaac. Genesis chapter 18 verse 2. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and, lo, three men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and bowed himself toward the ground. Genesis chapter 18 verse 2 is part of the narrative where Abraham receives a visit from the Lord and two angels. Let's delve deeper into the context and significance of this verse. Abraham's encounter. In the preceding verse, Abraham is depicted sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. When he lifts up his eyes and looks, he sees three men standing nearby. It becomes evident in the subsequent verses that one of the men is the Lord, often understood as a Christophany, an appearance of Christ before his incarnation, and the other two angels. Hospitality and respect. As soon as Abraham notices the presence of these visitors, he immediately runs to meet them. This demonstrates Abraham's reverence and respect towards these individuals. He humbly bows down to the ground as a gesture of submission and honor. Abraham's actions reveal his deep faith and understanding of the importance of showing hospitality to guests. Cultural significance. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, welcoming and showing hospitality to strangers or travelers was a significant social norm. It was considered a virtuous act and a moral obligation. Abraham, as a patriarch and a man of faith, exemplifies this cultural value by warmly receiving and attending to the needs of his visitors. Spiritual significance. The encounter described in this verse has spiritual significance as well. The Lord and the angels have come to convey a message to Abraham and his wife, Sarah, regarding the fulfillment of the promise of a son, Isaac, who would be born to them in their old age. This encounter serves as a pivotal moment in Abraham's journey of faith and plays a crucial role in God's unfolding plan. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 2 highlights Abraham's exemplary hospitality and respect towards his divine visitors, demonstrating his faith and obedience. It also emphasizes the cultural and spiritual significance of extending hospitality to others, reminding believers of the value of welcoming and serving others in a manner that reflects love and humility. Genesis chapter 18 verse 3, "And said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant." Genesis chapter 18 verse 3 is a verse from the Old Testament, which narrates the account of Abraham's encounter with three visitors, who are later revealed to be angels of the Lord. This particular verse captures Abraham's response as he extends hospitality and pleads with one of the visitors not to pass by, but rather to remain and partake of his hospitality. To better understand the significance of Genesis chapter 18 verse 3, it is helpful to examine the broader context of the chapter. In the preceding verses, we learn that Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day when he saw three men standing nearby. Recognizing them as divine visitors, he ran to meet them, bowed down, and welcomed them into his tent. It is during this encounter that Abraham speaks the words found in Genesis chapter 18 verse 3. This verse reveals several key aspects of Abraham's character and his relationship with God. Hospitality. Abraham's immediate response upon seeing the three visitors was to extend hospitality. Hospitality was highly valued in ancient Near Eastern culture, and Abraham exemplifies this virtue by offering food, water, and rest to the visitors. His urgency in asking them not to pass by reflects his desire to honor and serve them. Humility. Abraham addresses one of the visitors as "My Lord," acknowledging their authority and divine nature. This demonstrates Abraham's recognition of God's presence in the encounter and his reverence towards the divine. Favor and relationship with God. Abraham acknowledges that finding favor in the sight of the Lord is a privilege. He recognizes that this encounter is not merely coincidental but a significant moment of divine visitation. Abraham had already experienced a close relationship with God, having received promises and guidance from him, and this encounter further deepens their connection. Prayerful request. Abraham makes a humble request for the visitor not to pass away but to remain with him as his servant. This can be seen as an expression of his desire to continue to interact with the divine presence and receive further blessings, guidance, or revelation. Genesis chapter 18 verse 3 highlights Abraham's faith and trust in God as he opens his home and heart to the divine visitors. The hospitality displayed by Abraham in this verse is often commended as an example of how believers should welcome and care for others, as well as an example of how God's blessings can flow through acts of kindness and generosity. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 3 invites us to reflect on our own attitudes towards hospitality, humility, and prayerful interaction with God. It encourages us to recognize divine encounters and seize the opportunities to extend kindness and receive blessings, acknowledging that God's favor and presence can be experienced through acts of hospitality and faithful service. Genesis chapter 18 verse 4. "Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree." This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis chapter 18 where Abraham receives three visitors who are later revealed to be angels or messengers from God. Let's delve into the context and explore the significance of this verse. Context. In the preceding verses, Abraham sees three men standing near him and, recognizing their divine nature, he quickly runs to greet them. He shows great hospitality by bowing before them, inviting them to stay, and offering to refresh them with water and rest. The verse in question, Genesis chapter 18 verse 4, captures Abraham's request to have water brought for them to wash their feet and find respite under the tree. Hospitality in the ancient Near East. To understand the significance of this verse, it's essential to appreciate the cultural context of hospitality in the ancient Near East. In those times, showing hospitality to strangers, especially travelers, was considered a sacred duty. Guests were given protection, nourishment, and rest. Failing to extend hospitality was seen as a dishonorable act. Abraham, being a man of faith, exhibited remarkable hospitality towards his visitors, reflecting his reverence for God and his commitment to righteousness. Symbolic and spiritual meaning. The act of washing feet was a customary practice in the ancient Near East. Travelers' feet would become dirty and dusty from walking, so providing water to wash their feet was a sign of respect, humility, and care. In this passage, Abraham's gesture of providing water to wash the visitors' feet demonstrates his devotion to serving and honoring God's messengers. Symbolically, washing feet also carries deeper spiritual implications. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ, who is often seen as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, demonstrated the act of foot washing to his disciples as a symbol of humility and service. By washing the disciples' feet, Jesus taught them about the importance of selfless love, service, and humility in the kingdom of God. John chapter 13 verse 1 to verse 17. Abraham's act of washing the visitors' feet in Genesis chapter 18 verse 4 can be seen as an early foreshadowing of this principle. Additionally, the rest provided under the tree can be seen as a metaphor for finding shelter and solace in God's presence. In various biblical passages, trees are associated with provisions, rest, and spiritual nourishment. Abraham's invitation for the visitors to rest under the tree is a gesture of providing a place of comfort and protection, mirroring God's care and provision for his people. Lessons for believers. Genesis chapter 18 verse 4 reminds believers of the importance of extending hospitality, kindness, and care to others, especially to strangers. It encourages us to be attentive to the needs of those around us and to serve others with humility and love, just as Abraham did. This passage also highlights the significance of recognizing and responding to God's messengers, whether in the form of people in need or opportunities to show compassion. Furthermore, the act of washing feet reminds us of the call to humility and service. It prompts us to imitate Christ's example by humbly serving others and considering their needs above our own. By doing so, we reflect God's love and bring glory to His name. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 4 portrays Abraham's exceptional hospitality in offering water to wash the visitors' feet and rest under the tree. This act carries both cultural significance within the context of ancient Near Eastern hospitality and symbolic meaning in terms of humility, service, and finding solace in God's presence. As believers, we can draw lessons from this passage, learning to extend hospitality, show humility, and serve others with love, ultimately reflecting God's character. Genesis chapter 18 verse 5. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore are ye come to your servant. And they said, So do, as thou hast said. This verse is part of the narrative where Abraham, the patriarch, encounters three men who are actually heavenly visitors sent by God. Let's explore the context and meaning of this verse. Context. In Genesis chapter 18, the chapter begins with Abraham sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. He looks up and sees three men standing nearby. Recognizing their divine nature, Abraham runs to meet them and offers them hospitality. He invites them to rest and refresh themselves under the shade of a tree while he prepares a meal for them. Verse analysis. 1. Hospitality. Genesis chapter 18 verse 5 reflects Abraham's gracious hospitality toward his guests. When he addresses them, he promises to fetch a morsel of bread to satisfy their hunger. Abraham's eagerness to serve and his willingness to extend hospitality to strangers demonstrate his kindness and generosity. Comfort. Abraham's intent to comfort his guests' hearts is another notable aspect of this verse. Offering food is not just a means of satisfying physical hunger but also a way to provide comfort and nurture the soul. Abraham recognizes that sharing a meal together can be a source of encouragement and solace. Purpose. Abraham informs the visitors that their arrival is not accidental. He acknowledges that they have come to his dwelling specifically. By assuring them that they will pass on after they have been refreshed, Abraham acknowledges their journey and shows a readiness to fulfill their needs. Response. The visitors respond affirmatively to Abraham's offer, saying, "So do, as thou hast said." Their reply indicates that they accept the invitation and look forward to receiving the hospitality happening to the same. This demonstrates the text is cut off. Actually continues, this demonstrates This demonstrates their willingness to partake in the provisions Abraham has promised. Lessons and applications. Hospitality. Genesis chapter 18 verse 5 underscores the importance of showing hospitality and kindness to others. Abraham's example teaches us to extend a warm welcome, be attentive to the needs of those around us and offer comfort and nourishment when possible. Generosity. Abraham's willingness to provide food and, etc. Recognizing divine encounters. Abraham's recognition of the heavenly visitors and his response to their presence remind us to be discerning and open to the ways God may be at work in our lives. It encourages us to be sensitive to the opportunities we have to encounter and serve God through the people we meet. Spiritual nourishment. Beyond physical sustenance, the act of sharing a meal also represents fellowship and communion. It reminds us of the importance of nurturing spiritual connections and providing support and encouragement to others in their faith journeys. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 5 illustrates Abraham's hospitality, his intent to comfort his guests, and their affirmation of his offer. This verse serves as a reminder for us to emulate Abraham's generosity, recognize divine encounters, provide comfort and nourishment to others, and foster meaningful connections in our relationships. Genesis chapter 18 verse 6. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah, and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. This verse is part of the account of Abraham's encounter with 3 visitors, who were actually angels in disguise, near the oaks of Mamre. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse within the broader narrative. In Genesis chapter 18, we find Abraham dwelling in the land of Canaan. One day, as he sat by the tent entrance in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. Abraham immediately recognized their significance and quickly approached them to extend his hospitality. He bowed down and urged them to stay and rest under the shade of the tree while he attended to their needs. Verse 6 specifically describes Abraham's interaction with Sarah, his wife, after he had gone into their tent. He asked her to prepare a meal for their guests, emphasizing the urgency by using the word quickly. The instruction was to make 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. This verse highlights several important aspects. Hospitality. Abraham's response to the arrival of the visitors demonstrates the value of hospitality. He welcomed them warmly, offering them rest, shade, and refreshment. Hospitality was highly esteemed in ancient Near Eastern culture, and this passage exemplifies Abraham's generous and hospitable nature. Responsibility. Abraham took personal responsibility for caring for his guests. Despite his stature and status, he did not delegate the task to his servants but instead personally hurried to Sarah to request her assistance in preparing the meal. This shows his willingness to serve and provide for others. Abraham's faith. The immediacy of Abraham's response and his sense of urgency reveal his faith and obedience to God. He recognized that these visitors were not ordinary men but divine messengers. His swift action in attending to their needs reflects his desire to honor God by offering hospitality to his representatives. Sarah's role. The verse implies Sarah's participation in the preparation of the meal. Although the focus of the story is mainly on Abraham, Sarah's involvement underscores the importance of the unity and cooperation of a married couple. Their partnership in serving others demonstrates the value of shared responsibility and mutual support. Genesis chapter 18 verse 6 reminds believers of the significance of showing hospitality, taking personal responsibility for serving others, and acting with faith and obedience. It encourages us to be attentive to the needs of those around us and to respond promptly and generously. Additionally, it highlights the importance of unity and cooperation within marriage and family relationships. Genesis chapter 18 verse 7. And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. Context: Genesis chapter 18 is the chapter where Abraham receives a visit from 3 angelic visitors who came to announce the birth of Isaac and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this particular verse, Abraham shows great hospitality by quickly preparing a meal for his guests. Hospitality, the act of Abraham running to the herd and fetching a tender calf, demonstrates his hospitality and willingness to show kindness to his guests. Hospitality was highly valued in the ancient Near Eastern culture, and Abraham exemplifies this virtue by providing food and refreshment to the visitors. This story serves as an example of how believers should show hospitality and generosity towards others. Promptness. Abraham's response is marked by promptness and urgency. He doesn't delay in providing for his guests but quickly takes action to prepare a meal for them. This shows his eagerness to serve and his recognition of the importance of attending to the needs of others in a timely manner. It reminds us of the value of being responsive and proactive in our relationships with others. Symbolic significance. The choice of a tender and good calf for the meal may carry some symbolic meaning. In the Bible, the calf often symbolizes abundance, celebration, and sacrifice. By offering a calf, Abraham not only provides a generous meal but also presents an act of worship and thanksgiving to God through this sacrificial gesture. Foreshadowing. This verse also foreshadows the concept of God's provision and blessings. The visitation of the angelic visitors and the promise of Isaac's birth signify God's faithfulness to his covenant with Abraham. The act of Abraham providing the calf for the meal can be seen as a representation of God's provision and blessing in response to Abraham's faith and hospitality. Application. Hospitality. We can learn from Abraham's example of hospitality and strive to show kindness, generosity, and hospitality to those around us, whether they are strangers or friends. Promptness. Abraham's prompt response teaches us the importance of not delaying in meeting the needs of others. We should be ready to serve and help others in a timely manner. Sacrificial worship. Abraham's offering of a calf reminds us of the importance of sacrificial worship and thanksgiving. We can express our gratitude to God through acts of worship and by offering ourselves and our resources to Him. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 7 highlights Abraham's hospitality, promptness, and sacrificial worship, providing valuable lessons for us to apply in our lives today. Genesis chapter 18 verse 8. And he took butter, and milk, and the calf which he had dressed, and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. Context. Genesis chapter 18 records the account of Abraham's encounter with 3 men, who were actually angels sent by God. The chapter begins with Abraham sitting by the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day when he sees the 3 visitors standing nearby. Recognizing their significance, Abraham offers them hospitality and prepares a meal for them. Hospitality in the ancient Near East. Hospitality was an important cultural practice in the ancient Near East, including the time of Abraham. Offering hospitality to strangers or guests was considered a virtue, and it reflected the host's generosity and willingness to care for others. Abraham, being a man of faith and righteousness, demonstrated exceptional hospitality to the 3 visitors. The preparation of the meal. In verse 8, we see that Abraham personally takes charge of preparing the meal for his guests. He selects a tender calf, dresses it, meaning he prepares it for cooking, and sets it before the visitors. He also provides them with butter or curds and milk. Symbolism and spiritual significance. While the act of preparing a meal and offering food may seem ordinary, This passage carries deeper symbolism and spiritual significance. Generosity and hospitality. Abraham's act of providing a meal reflects his generous and hospitable nature. It serves as an example for believers to follow, demonstrating the importance of welcoming and caring for others. Symbol of sacrifice. The calf that Abraham prepared and served can be seen as a symbolic offering or sacrifice. It was customary to offer the best and finest food to guests, indicating the value placed on their presence. In this case, Abraham's actions foreshadow the sacrificial system that would later be established in Israel, where animals were offered to God as a symbol of devotion and atonement. Foreshadowing the Messianic banquet. Some biblical scholars see this passage as a foreshadowing of the Messianic banquet, a future event where believers will be gathered to feast with God. The meal shared by Abraham and the visitors under the tree may be seen as a picture of the fellowship and communion believers will have with God in the future. Lessons for Christians today. The passage holds several practical lessons for Christians today. Hospitality. It reminds believers of the importance of practicing hospitality and kindness towards others. By welcoming strangers and guests, we have the opportunity to show God's love and share His blessings. Generosity. Abraham's generosity in offering the best he had challenges believers to be generous in their giving, not only in material possessions but also in time, love, and compassion. Faithfulness in everyday tasks. Abraham took personal responsibility for preparing the meal. This teaches us that even ordinary tasks can be acts of faithfulness and service to God. Whatever we do, whether big or small, we can do it with excellence and for the glory of God. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 18 verse 8 showcases Abraham's hospitality, generosity, and his willingness to serve others. This passage serves as a reminder to Christians today to embrace these virtues in our interactions with others, and it points to deeper spiritual symbolism related to sacrifice and the future fellowship believers will enjoy with God. Genesis chapter 18 verse 9. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. Context. In Genesis chapter 18, we find the account of Abraham's encounter with 3 visitors who came to him near the oaks of Mamre. These visitors were actually angels sent by God, and they brought Abraham a message regarding the fulfillment of God's promise to give him a son through Sarah. The question about Sarah, in chapter 18 verse 9, the visitors ask Abraham about the whereabouts of his wife Sarah. This question serves a specific purpose. It leads to the revelation of God's plan to give Abraham and Sarah a son in their old age, fulfilling the promise of a descendant through whom all nations would be blessed. Importance of Sarah's presence. When the visitors inquire about Sarah, Abraham responds by saying she is in the tent. This reveals an interesting aspect of Sarah's role in the unfolding of God's plan. Sarah represents the promise and the blessing of God. Her presence in the tent signifies her position as a central figure in the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham. Symbolism of the tent. The tent represents the dwelling place or domain of Sarah. It symbolizes her role as the mother and nurturer of the promised child. The fact that she is inside the tent suggests the idea of protection, intimacy, and the sanctity of the family unit. Sarah's initial doubt. Earlier in Genesis, Sarah had laughed when she overheard the visitors' promise of a son. She found it hard to believe due to her old age. This question about Sarah's whereabouts may serve as a gentle reminder to Sarah that God's promise still stands and that she should not lose faith. It emphasizes her involvement in the divine plan and reinforces the trust she needs to have in God's faithfulness. Lessons for us. Genesis chapter 18 verse 9 reminds us of the importance of trust and faith in God's promises. Just as Sarah had doubts, we may also find ourselves questioning God's plans or timing. However, this verse encourages us to remember that God's promises are sure, even when circumstances seem impossible. It reminds us that God works through individuals, using their faith and obedience to bring about His purposes. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 9 highlights the question asked about Sarah's whereabouts. which serves as a reminder of God's promise and Sarah's central role in the fulfillment of that promise. It teaches us about the importance of trust and faith in God's plans, even when faced with doubts and difficult circumstances. Genesis chapter 18 verse 10. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and, lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. In this verse, we witness an encounter between Abraham and 3 angelic visitors who had come to him near the oaks of Mamre. Abraham had shown him great hospitality, providing them with food and rest. During their visit, they revealed to Abraham and Sarah the promise of a son, despite their old age. This verse specifically focuses on the conversation between Abraham and one of the visitors. The visitor informs Abraham that he will indeed return to him, emphasizing the time frame, according to the time of life. The meaning behind this phrase can be interpreted as a reference to the appropriate time for conception and childbirth, indicating that the promise of a son would be fulfilled in due course. It is important to note that at this point, both Abraham and Sarah were quite advanced in age. Sarah had been barren throughout her life, and they had long given up hope of having children together. The news of Sarah conceiving and bearing a son was astonishing and seemingly impossible. Sarah, who overheard the conversation from the tent door, reacted with disbelief, as we see in the following verses. Genesis chapter 18 verse 11 to 12 KJV continues, Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. Sarah's response reveals her doubt and amusement at the thought of having a child in her old age. The situation seemed impossible from a human perspective. However, the visitors were not ordinary men. They were messengers from God, with the power to bring about the fulfillment of God's promises. Genesis chapter 18 verse 13 to 14 KJV continues, And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed, I will return unto thee, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. God, who was present in the form of one of the visitors, questioned Abraham about Sarah's laughter. He affirmed his promise once again, reiterating that Sarah would indeed bear a son. God also posed a rhetorical question, emphasizing his unlimited power and ability to perform miracles. He reassured Abraham that nothing was too difficult for him. The story of Genesis chapter 18 verse 10 and the subsequent verses demonstrates God's faithfulness to his promises, even in seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite the advanced age of Abraham and Sarah, God affirmed that Sarah would conceive and bear a son. This miraculous birth would serve as a testament to God's power and his ability to accomplish the extraordinary. Ultimately, this promise was fulfilled, and Sarah gave birth to Isaac, who became a pivotal figure in God's plan for his people. This passage also highlights the importance of faith and trust in God's promises, even when they seem unlikely or beyond human comprehension. Abraham and Sarah's journey teaches us that God is able to fulfill his word in his perfect timing and according to his divine plan, regardless of the obstacles we may face. Genesis chapter 18 verse 11. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis where Abraham and Sarah receive a visit from 3 men who are actually angels. In this particular passage, the focus is on the state of Abraham and Sarah in their old age and their inability to conceive children. Context: to better understand Genesis chapter 18 verse 11, it is important to consider the surrounding context. Prior to this verse, Abraham had received a visit from God in the form of 3 men, one of whom was the Lord himself. Abraham showed great hospitality towards them and prepared a meal for them. During the visit, God reiterated his promise to Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son, even though they were advanced in years. Genesis chapter 18 verses 9 to 10. Advanced age. Genesis chapter 18 verse 11 highlights the advanced age of Abraham and Sarah, emphasizing that they were old and well stricken in age. This description serves to emphasize the natural limitations and impossibility of conceiving a child at their stage in life. It underscores the fact that their bodies were no longer capable of bearing children. Sarah's condition. The latter part of the verse states that it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. This phrase refers to the fact that Sarah had reached menopause and was no longer experiencing menstruation or able to conceive children. It reinforces the impossibility of Sarah having a child naturally, given her age and biological condition. God's divine intervention. The significance of this verse lies in the contrast between the physical limitations of Abraham and Sarah and God's promise to give them a child. Despite their age and Sarah's inability to conceive, God reaffirms His promise to bless them with a son. This serves as a demonstration of God's power and ability to fulfill His promises, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Lessons and applications. Genesis chapter 18 verse 11 reminds us of the importance of trusting in God's promises, even when they seem unlikely or impossible. It encourages us to have faith in God's ability to work beyond the limitations of human understanding or natural circumstances. It also teaches us that God's plans are not hindered by our physical limitations or the obstacles we face. Instead, God's power and faithfulness can surpass any human limitations, bringing about His purposes and fulfilling His promises. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 18 verse 11 highlights the advanced age of Abraham and Sarah and the biological impossibility of Sarah conceiving a child. This verse sets the stage for God's miraculous intervention and serves as a reminder of the power and faithfulness of God in fulfilling His promises, even when the circumstances seem impossible. Genesis chapter 18 verse 12. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. This verse occurs when Sarah, Abraham's wife, overhears the three men discussing the promise that she would bear a son. At this point, both Abraham and Sarah were advanced in years, and Sarah had been unable to conceive throughout her life. When Sarah hears the news that she would bear a child, she inwardly laughs, expressing doubt and incredulity due to their old age. This passage provides some significant insights and lessons. Sarah's doubt. Sarah's laughter is indicative of her disbelief and doubt regarding the fulfillment of God's promise. Her reaction highlights the human tendency to doubt when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. Sarah's doubt is understandable given her old age and the biological improbability of conceiving at that stage in life. God's faithfulness. Despite Sarah's doubt, God remains faithful to His promise. In the subsequent verses, Genesis chapter 18 verse 13 to 15, God confronts Sarah's laughter and reaffirms His promise to her. God reminds her that nothing is too difficult for Him and that the birth of a child, even in old age, is within His power. Lessons in faith. Sarah's doubt and subsequent correction from God teach us important lessons about faith. First, they demonstrate that it's natural to question and doubt when faced with challenging circumstances. However, they also emphasize the importance of surrendering our doubts and placing our trust in God's sovereignty and faithfulness. God's response to Sarah's doubt serves as a reminder that He can bring about the fulfillment of His promises, regardless of how impossible or unlikely they may seem to us. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 12 serves as a reminder that even in moments of doubt, we can trust in God's faithfulness. It encourages us to place our faith in Him and believe that He is able to fulfill His promises, even when the circumstances appear unfavorable or unlikely. Genesis chapter 18 verse 13. And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child, which am old? In this verse, we witness an encounter between Abraham, his wife Sarah, and three visitors who were actually angelic beings. Prior to this verse, these visitors informed Abraham that Sarah would bear a son within a year, despite her old age. Sarah, who was listening from the tent, laughed within herself upon hearing this news. Then, the Lord questioned Abraham about Sarah's laughter. This verse highlights an essential theme found throughout the Bible: the fulfillment of God's promises. In the preceding chapters of Genesis, God made a covenant with Abraham, promising him descendants as numerous as the stars and that through his offspring, all nations would be blessed. However, Sarah's barrenness posed a significant obstacle to the fulfillment of this promise. She had already passed the age of childbearing, making the notion of giving birth seemingly impossible. Sarah's laughter, though inaudible to the visitors, revealed her skepticism and doubt regarding the fulfillment of God's promise. In fact, later in Genesis chapter 18 verse 15, Sarah even denied laughing when the visitors questioned her about it, perhaps out of fear or embarrassment. This verse reminds us that even those who have a close relationship with God can experience moments of doubt and disbelief. Sarah's laughter reflects her struggle to trust in God's ability to bring about the impossible. However, the Lord's response to her laughter provides valuable lessons for us. In the following verse, Genesis chapter 18 verse 14, the Lord poses a rhetorical question to Abraham: "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This question not only challenges Sarah's doubt but also serves as a reminder of God's omnipotence and sovereignty over all things. It emphasizes that nothing is impossible for God, and He is fully capable of fulfilling His promises, even in situations that seem utterly improbable or against human understanding. Furthermore, Sarah's laughter and subsequent denial teach us about the importance of honesty and transparency with God. God knows our hearts, and we cannot hide our doubts or skepticism from Him. Sarah's laughter did not go unnoticed by the Lord, and this emphasizes the significance of being genuine before God, trusting Him enough to share our doubts and fears openly. Ultimately, despite Sarah's doubt, God remained faithful to His promise. In Genesis chapter 21 verses 1 and 2, Sarah conceived and gave birth to a son, Isaac, at the appointed time, exactly as God had promised. Through Isaac, the lineage of Abraham continued, eventually leading to the birth of Jesus Christ, who became the Savior of the world. The story of Sarah's laughter serves as a reminder that God's promises are trustworthy and that our doubts and disbelief do not hinder His faithfulness. It encourages us to surrender our doubts to God, honestly seeking His guidance and trusting in His ability to accomplish the impossible in our lives. Genesis chapter 18 verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis where God appears to Abraham and informs him that Sarah, his wife, will have a son. At this point, Abraham and Sarah were old and well beyond the age of childbearing. Sarah, upon hearing this, laughed to herself because she considered herself too old to bear children. This verse highlights an essential aspect of the nature of God, His omnipotence. The question posed, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" serves as a rhetorical question, emphasizing that nothing is too difficult or impossible for God. It serves to reinforce the fact that God's power and abilities transcend human limitations. Throughout the Bible, there are numerous instances where God demonstrates His unlimited power and ability to accomplish the seemingly impossible. From creating the world out of nothing Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 to parting the Red Sea Exodus chapter 14 verse 21 to verse 22 and raising Jesus from the dead Matthew chapter 28 verse 6, the Bible repeatedly affirms God's unlimited power and ability. In the context of Genesis chapter 18 verse 14, God's promise to Abraham and Sarah serves as a reminder that God's plans and purposes are not limited by human circumstances or human understanding. Sarah's skepticism and laughter upon hearing the promise of having a child were understandable from a human perspective, given their old age. However, God's response affirms that His power is not bound by human limitations. This verse also carries a broader message for believers today. It encourages us to trust in God's power and faithfulness, even when faced with seemingly impossible situations. It reminds us that God is capable of bringing about His promises, even when circumstances appear to be contrary. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 14 highlights the omnipotence of God and serves as a reminder that nothing is too difficult for Him. It encourages us to trust in God's power and faithfulness, even when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances, and reminds us that God's plans and purposes are not limited by human understanding or limitations. Genesis chapter 18 verse 15. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. This verse is a part of the account where three visitors, who are actually angelic beings, appear to Abraham and Sarah. The visitors inform Abraham that Sarah, who was barren, would have a son within a year. Context: Genesis chapter 18 verse 1 to verse 14. In the preceding verses, Abraham encounters these three visitors near the oaks of Mamre. He shows them great hospitality, providing a meal and demonstrating respect. The visitors then promise that Sarah will have a son, which leads to Sarah's incredulous response. Sarah's reaction. In verse 12, Sarah's initial reaction to hearing she would bear a child is to laugh inwardly. She finds the idea amusing or beyond belief, considering her old age and the fact that both she and Abraham are well beyond childbearing years. In verse 13, the Lord, who is present among the visitors, addresses Sarah directly, questioning her laughter. Sarah's denial. Genesis chapter 18 verse 15 records Sarah's response to being called out by the Lord. She denies having laughed, possibly out of fear or embarrassment. It highlights her lack of faith in the promise made to her and Abraham. However, the Lord knows the truth, as He sees into the hearts of individuals. The consequences. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 16 to verse 21, the Lord reiterates the promise of Sarah conceiving a son. The visitors then prepare to leave, and Abraham walks with them. The next scene involves the Lord discussing with Abraham His plans to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah. The passage concludes with the Lord revealing His intentions to Abraham, who pleads for mercy on behalf of any righteous individuals living in those cities. Lessons and applications. Honesty and integrity. Sarah's denial of her laughter serves as a reminder that honesty and integrity are important in our relationship with God. It is futile to try to deceive Him, as He knows the secrets of our hearts. Instead, we should strive for openness and truthfulness in our interactions with Him. Trust in God's promises. Sarah's laughter, both inwardly and in her denial, reflects her struggle to fully believe in God's promise of a child. Similarly, we may face situations where God's promises seem impossible or too difficult to believe. This passage encourages us to trust in God's faithfulness and power to fulfill His word, even when circumstances appear contrary. God's knowledge and discernment. The Lord's response to Sarah's denial demonstrates His omniscience. He sees and understands everything, including the thoughts and intentions of our hearts. This truth should inspire us to approach Him with reverence and honesty, knowing that we cannot hide anything from Him. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 15 highlights Sarah's initial disbelief and her subsequent denial when confronted by the Lord. It teaches us about the importance of honesty, trust in God's promises, and the recognition that God sees and knows all things. Genesis chapter 18 verse 16. And the men rose up from thence, and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring him on the way. Genesis chapter 18 verse 16 is a transitional verse that sets the stage for the events that follow. To better understand its significance, let's explore the broader context of this verse. In Genesis chapter 18, the chapter begins with Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, encountering three men who are later revealed to be divine messengers. These messengers visited Abraham near the oaks of Mamre, where he was dwelling at the time. Abraham, known for his hospitality and reverence towards God, warmly welcomes these visitors and offers them food and refreshment. Verse 16 marks a pivotal moment when the three men rise from their resting place and direct their attention towards Sodom, a city known for its wickedness. Abraham accompanies the visitors as they depart, a gesture that displays his gracious hospitality and respect for these divine messengers. This verse holds significance on multiple levels. Firstly, it emphasizes Abraham's role as a faithful servant of God. Despite his advanced age, Abraham humbly serves his guests, displaying a sense of duty and respect for God's messengers. Abraham's actions illustrate the virtue of hospitality and how it can manifest in our lives. Secondly, the verse introduces the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a significant event in the biblical narrative. The attention given to Sodom and Abraham's connection to the unfolding events foreshadows the subsequent dialogue between Abraham and God regarding the city's fate. This dialogue demonstrates Abraham's compassion, intercession, and his desire for God's justice to be tempered with mercy. Moreover, this verse highlights the contrast between the righteous character of Abraham and the wickedness of Sodom. Abraham, by his actions, serves as an example of righteousness and faithfulness, while Sodom represents the depths of human depravity. This dichotomy becomes more evident as the narrative progresses. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 16 marks a transition in the story, highlighting Abraham's hospitality and his role in the upcoming events concerning the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. This verse serves as a reminder of the importance of showing hospitality, as well as the stark contrast between righteousness and wickedness. It also paves the way for a profound conversation between Abraham and God regarding justice, mercy, and the righteous remnant. Genesis chapter 18 verse 17. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do?" This verse is part of the narrative where the Lord visits Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. The context leading up to this verse is crucial for understanding its significance. In the preceding verses, 3 men appear to Abraham, who offers them hospitality. It becomes evident that one of the men is the Lord himself and the other 2 angels. In verse 17, the Lord questions whether he should hide his intentions from Abraham. This statement is somewhat rhetorical, as the Lord already knows that he wants to reveal his plan to Abraham. However, this question provides an opportunity for God to engage in a dialogue with Abraham and express his purposes to him. The verse raises a couple of important points: intimacy and communication with God. The Lord's question reveals the special relationship he has with Abraham. God considers Abraham as his friend and confidant. He desires to share his plans with Abraham, not out of necessity, but out of a deep relationship. This shows us that God desires to have an intimate and communicative relationship with his people. God's will and revelation. The Lord's question also highlights his sovereignty and the fact that he chooses to reveal his will to humanity. God could have simply carried out his plan without involving Abraham, but he chooses to include him in the process. This demonstrates God's desire to partner with human beings and involve them in his purposes. In the subsequent verses, God reveals his intention to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah and ultimately destroy those cities. Abraham, upon hearing this, intercedes for the righteous people in those cities, negotiating with God to spare them. This interaction showcases the depth of Abraham's relationship with God and his concern for justice and mercy. Genesis chapter 18 verse 17 sets the stage for the dialogue between God and Abraham, highlighting the significance of their relationship and God's willingness to communicate his plans. It reminds us of the importance of seeking a close relationship with God and being open to his revelation in our lives. Genesis chapter 18 verse 18. Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. This verse is part of a conversation between God and Abraham. It comes after God has appeared to Abraham in the form of 3 visitors and shared the news that Sarah, Abraham's wife, will have a son despite their old age. The visitors are actually heavenly messengers, and during their visit, God reveals his plan to destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 18, God is speaking to himself, considering the implications of his relationship with Abraham. Let's explore the key elements of this verse and its significance. Abraham's promise. God acknowledges that Abraham will become a great and mighty nation. This reaffirms the promise God made to Abraham earlier in Genesis chapter 12 verse 2 to verse 3, where he said, "I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." Here, God reiterates his commitment to fulfilling his promise to Abraham. A blessing to all nations. God states that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. This declaration has significant theological implications. Through Abraham's lineage, specifically through his descendant Jesus Christ, God would provide salvation for all people, not just for the nation of Israel. This promise is fulfilled through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who is a descendant of Abraham. The Messiah, God's promise to bless all nations through Abraham, ultimately finds its fulfillment in Jesus Christ, who is often referred to as the seed of Abraham. Galatians chapter 3 verse 16. Through Jesus, people from every nation have the opportunity to receive forgiveness, reconciliation with God, and eternal life. This verse in Genesis foreshadows God's redemptive plan for humanity through the Messiah. Faith and obedience. Abraham's relationship with God is characterized by faith and obedience. His faith is demonstrated through his willingness to trust God's promises and act upon them. Throughout the Bible, Abraham is portrayed as a model of faith and righteousness. Romans chapter 4 verse 3, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 8 to verse 19. God's pronouncement in Genesis chapter 18 verse 18 reflects the significance of Abraham's faith and obedience and how it impacts not only his own life, but also the destinies of nations. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 18 underscores God's faithfulness to fulfill his promises and reveals his redemptive plan for all nations through Abraham's lineage. It points to Jesus Christ as the ultimate fulfillment of the promise, offering salvation to people from every nation who put their faith in him. The verse highlights the importance of faith and obedience in our relationship with God, as exemplified by Abraham. Genesis chapter 18 verse 19. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. This verse is part of the account where the Lord appeared to Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. In this encounter, God informed Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son in their old age. It also serves as a reflection of Abraham's character and his role in leading his household. Recognition of Abraham's faithfulness. The verse begins with God saying, "For I know him." This statement shows that God had intimate knowledge of Abraham's character and conduct. God recognized that Abraham was a man of faith and righteousness. This acknowledgement highlights the close relationship between God and Abraham, emphasizing that God had chosen him as a faithful servant. Abraham's leadership. The verse continues, that he will command his children and his household after him. Here, God affirms Abraham's role as a leader within his family. Abraham's faith extended beyond his personal relationship with God. It was also reflected in his responsibility to guide his household. He was expected to provide spiritual leadership and instruction to his children and the members of his household. This demonstrates the significance of family leadership and the influence it has on the spiritual well-being of a household. Keeping the way of the Lord. God further reveals the purpose of Abraham's leadership by stating, "They shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment." Abraham was entrusted with the task of ensuring that his family and household followed God's ways and lived in righteousness. This responsibility involved teaching them God's commandments, cultivating a culture of justice, and maintaining a standard of right behavior. God's promise. The verse concludes with God's promise to bring upon Abraham what he had spoken. By faithfully leading his family and ensuring they walked in the ways of the Lord, Abraham would position himself and his descendants to receive the fulfillment of God's promises. This promise refers to the covenant God made with Abraham, which included numerous blessings, such as making him a great nation and blessing all nations through his seed. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 to 3. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 19 emphasizes the importance of family leadership, as seen in Abraham's role in commanding his children and household after him. It underscores the responsibility of parents and spiritual leaders to guide their families in following God's ways and living righteously. Additionally, the verse assures that by fulfilling this role faithfully, God's promises and blessings will be realized in their lives. Please note that this interpretation is based on the understanding of the passage in its biblical and historical context. Different interpretations may exist, and it's always beneficial to study the Bible further and consult trusted biblical resources for a comprehensive understanding. Genesis chapter 18 verse 20. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham's encounter with three visitors, who are actually angels of the Lord, near the oaks of Mamre. The preceding verses describe how Abraham had shown hospitality to these visitors and how they had informed him of the promise that Sarah, his wife, would bear him a son. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 20, the Lord reveals to Abraham the reason for his visit to the region. The Lord states that he has heard the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah and has seen the great wickedness and grievous sins committed by the people of those cities. This verse provides important context for the events that follow in Genesis chapter 18 and 19, where the angels proceed to Sodom and Gomorrah to investigate the sinfulness of the cities and pronounce judgment upon them. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah has been a topic of much discussion and interpretation throughout history. While the exact nature of their sins is not explicitly mentioned in this verse, the overall biblical narrative and subsequent passages suggest that their sins involved grave moral and ethical transgressions. The term Sodom and Gomorrah has often been associated with sexual immorality, particularly homosexuality, but it is important to note that the Bible does not provide a detailed account of their sins in this particular verse. The mention of the Lord hearing the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah emphasizes God's attentiveness to the moral state of humanity and his commitment to justice. This verse underscores the importance of righteous living and serves as a reminder of the consequences of persistent and unrepentant sin. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 20 highlights the Lord's awareness of the great wickedness and grievous sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. It sets the stage for the subsequent events where judgment is pronounced upon these cities. The verse underscores the importance of moral righteousness and serves as a reminder of God's justice and his response to unrepentant sin. Genesis chapter 18 verse 21. I will go down now, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham's encounter with three visitors, who are revealed to be angels of the Lord. Prior to this verse, the Lord had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son in their old age. Sarah laughed in disbelief, but the Lord affirmed that nothing is too hard for him. In verse 20, the Lord shares his intention to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 21, the Lord declares that he will personally go down and assess whether the city's actions align with the outcry that has reached him. He states, I will go down now, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. This verse reveals several important aspects about God's character and his interaction with humanity. God's omniscience. The verse begins with the phrase, I will go down now, and see. This language is anthropomorphic, as if God were physically going to the location to investigate. However, it is important to note that God is all-knowing, and nothing is hidden from him. The phrase, and if not, I will know, emphasizes his complete knowledge and understanding of all things. God is not limited by human perception or information, he already knows the truth. God's righteous judgment. The Lord states that he will determine whether the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah have acted in accordance with the outcry against them. This suggests that there has been great wickedness and injustice in these cities, and God intends to bring judgment accordingly. It demonstrates his commitment to justice and his willingness to intervene in human affairs when necessary. God's personal involvement. The Lord's statement, I will go down now, highlights his active engagement with humanity. It shows that God does not remain distant or disconnected from his creation. Instead, he involves himself in the lives of individuals and communities. In this case, God personally investigates the situation in Sodom and Gomorrah before taking action. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 21 reveals God's omniscience, his righteous judgment, and his personal involvement with humanity. It reminds us that God is fully aware of our actions, and he is just in his dealings. It also encourages us to approach God with reverence and humility, recognizing his wisdom and perfect knowledge. Genesis chapter 18 verse 22. And the men turned their faces from thence, and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord. In this verse, we find Abraham in a unique encounter with the Lord and two angelic beings who appeared to him near the oaks of Mamre. Abraham had welcomed them into his presence and showed them great hospitality, including preparing a meal for them. During their time together, the Lord revealed to Abraham his intention to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah and to judge them accordingly. Verse 22 marks a significant moment in the narrative as the men, referring to the Lord and the angels, turn their faces and begin to head toward Sodom. However, Abraham remains standing before the Lord. This action by Abraham demonstrates his deep reverence and concern for the fate of the cities. Now, let's explore the significance and lessons we can derive from this verse. Abraham's boldness and intercession. Abraham's posture of standing before the Lord signifies his boldness and confidence in approaching God. Despite knowing that the Lord is about to judge the cities, Abraham seizes the opportunity to intercede on behalf of the righteous people who might be residing in Sodom and Gomorrah. His standing before the Lord is an act of intercessory prayer, pleading for mercy and justice. Abraham's concern for righteousness. Abraham's actions reflect his deep concern for righteousness and his desire to see justice prevail. He understood the wickedness prevalent in Sodom and Gomorrah but hoped that there might be a few righteous individuals who could be spared from destruction. His boldness in interceding for the righteous reveals his compassionate and caring nature. The importance of prayer. Abraham's standing before the Lord reminds us of the power and significance of prayer. He didn't just accept the impending judgment but actively sought to intercede and change the outcome through his conversation with God. This teaches us the importance of earnest and persistent prayer, appealing to God for mercy and intervention in the face of challenging circumstances. Trusting God's judgment. Although Abraham interceded, he ultimately trusted God's judgment. He acknowledged God's sovereignty and righteousness in making decisions. His intercession did not stem from a lack of trust in God's justice but rather a desire to see if there were righteous people who could be saved. As we study this verse, we learn the importance of aligning our prayers with God's will and trusting in his wisdom and righteousness. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 22 highlights Abraham's boldness in interceding for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. It teaches us about the power of prayer, the importance of standing up for righteousness, and the need to trust in God's judgment. As we reflect on this verse, may it inspire us to approach God with boldness, pray fervently, and seek his will in all circumstances. Genesis chapter 18 verse 23. And Abraham drew near, and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Genesis chapter 18 verse 23 is part of the narrative where God appeared to Abraham in the form of three visitors, commonly known as the visit of the three angels. In this verse, Abraham is engaging in a dialogue with the Lord, interceding for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Context. Before examining this specific verse, it's important to understand the broader context of Genesis chapter 18. In the preceding verses, Abraham welcomed the three visitors and showed them great hospitality. During their time together, the Lord revealed that Sarah, Abraham's wife, would bear a son in her old age. Then, the narrative shifts to the discussion about the impending judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. Intercession. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 23, we see Abraham's remarkable intercessory prayer. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Abraham approaches God and respectfully questions his intentions. He appeals to God's justice, questioning whether he would destroy the righteous along with the wicked. Abraham's concern for the righteous reveals his compassionate nature and his desire for mercy to prevail. Dialogue with God. The dialogue between Abraham and God in this passage highlights the remarkable relationship Abraham had with the Lord. Abraham engages in a respectful conversation with God, expressing his concern and seeking to understand his plans. Through this exchange, we witness the depth of Abraham's faith and his confidence in God's righteousness. God's response. As the narrative unfolds, we see that God responds favorably to Abraham's intercession. Abraham presents various hypothetical scenarios, asking God to spare the cities if a certain number of righteous people are found within them. In response, God agrees to spare the cities for the sake of the righteous. This dialogue demonstrates God's willingness to listen to his faithful servant and his mercy toward those who are righteous. Lessons and applications. Genesis chapter 18 verse 23 teaches us several important lessons. Firstly, it highlights the importance of intercessory prayer. Abraham's boldness to approach God on behalf of others encourages us to pray fervently for the well-being of those around us. Secondly, the passage emphasizes the righteousness of God. Abraham's question implicitly acknowledges God's just nature and trust in his character. Finally, this verse reminds us of God's willingness to hear and respond to the heartfelt prayers of his people. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 18 verse 23 portrays Abraham's intercession on behalf of the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. It illustrates Abraham's faith, his respectful dialogue with God, and God's response of mercy. This passage encourages us to approach God in prayer, trust in his righteousness, and intercede for others in times of need. Genesis chapter 18 verse 24. And peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city, wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? In this verse, Abraham is engaged in a remarkable conversation with the Lord regarding the impending judgment and destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham, driven by concern for the righteous inhabitants, presents a thought-provoking question to God. Let's explore the context and significance of this verse. Context. In Genesis chapter 18, we find the account of God's visitation to Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. As Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent, 3 men appeared, and Abraham extended his hospitality to them. These men were actually angels sent by God, Genesis chapter 19 verse 1. During their visit, they informed Abraham about the forthcoming judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah due to the grievous sins committed by their inhabitants. Abraham's intercession. Upon hearing this, Abraham, aware of his nephew Lot's presence in Sodom, begins to intercede on behalf of the cities. He recognizes the righteousness and justice of God but appeals for mercy and compassion. Abraham questions God with the hope of finding a way to spare the righteous inhabitants of the cities. Significance of Genesis chapter 18 verse 24. Genesis chapter 18 verse 24 captures one of the key questions Abraham poses to God in his intercession. He begins by proposing the possibility of 50 righteous people residing in the city of Sodom. Abraham wonders if God would spare the entire city if even 50 righteous individuals were found there. This question stems from Abraham's concern for the innocent and righteous people living amidst the wickedness. Lessons from Genesis chapter 18 verse 24. Concern for righteousness. Abraham's intercession showcases his deep concern for righteousness and justice. It reminds us of the importance of caring for the welfare of the righteous and seeking their protection. God's mercy and justice. Abraham's question reflects his understanding of God's character as both merciful and just. He appeals to God's mercy by asking if the righteous would be spared. At the same time, he acknowledges God's justice by recognizing that judgment may still be necessary if the cities lack the required number of righteous individuals. The power of intercession. Abraham's conversation with God demonstrates the power of intercessory prayer. It reveals that God is open to dialogue and willing to consider the requests of his faithful servants. God's willingness to spare. The conversation between Abraham and God in Genesis chapter 18 verse 24 reveals God's willingness to spare an entire city for the sake of a few righteous individuals. This demonstrates God's immense patience and mercy, emphasizing his desire to save as many as possible from destruction. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 24 highlights Abraham's deep concern for righteousness and his boldness in interceding on behalf of others. It also showcases God's mercy, justice, and willingness to listen to the prayers and petitions of his faithful followers. This verse encourages us to approach God in prayer, seeking his mercy, and demonstrating care for the well-being of others. Genesis chapter 18 verse 25. That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked, that be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? This verse is part of the dialogue between Abraham and God when Abraham intercedes for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The context is that God has revealed to Abraham that he is going to destroy these cities due to their great wickedness. Abraham, concerned for his nephew Lot and the righteous people living in those cities, pleads with God for mercy. In this particular verse, Abraham expresses his faith in God's justice. He appeals to God's righteous nature and questions whether it would be just for the righteous to suffer the same fate as the wicked. Abraham recognizes that it would be contrary to God's character to punish the righteous along with the wicked. This verse highlights several important theological principles. God's justice. Abraham affirms his belief that God is just and fair. He acknowledges that it would be far from God's nature to treat the righteous and the wicked in the same manner. This reflects the biblical understanding that God is a righteous judge who will ultimately bring justice to all. Concern for the righteous. Abraham's plea emphasizes his concern for the righteous individuals who might be affected by the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He understands that even if the cities are filled with wickedness, there may still be righteous people within them. Abraham's intercession shows his compassion and desire to see the righteous spared from judgment. Faith in God's character. Abraham's question, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" reveals his trust in God's character. He believes that God will act in accordance with his own righteous nature. This demonstrates Abraham's confidence in God's ability to discern between the righteous and the wicked and to administer justice accordingly. The dialogue between Abraham and God in this passage showcases the significance of intercession and the importance of faith in God's justice. It reminds believers of the righteousness of God and encourages them to approach him with their concerns, knowing that he will always do what is right. Genesis chapter 18 verse 26. And the Lord said, If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Context. The story of Genesis chapter 18 verse 26 recounts the visit of 3 angelic visitors to Abraham and Sarah, who inform Abraham of the forthcoming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their wickedness. Abraham intercedes with God on behalf of the righteous in those cities, questioning whether God would destroy the righteous along with the wicked. The righteousness of Abraham. In the preceding verses, Abraham pleads with the Lord to spare the city of Sodom if there were 50 righteous people found there. His intercession reflects his compassion for the innocent and his desire to see God's mercy and justice manifested. It also demonstrates Abraham's closeness with God, as he boldly negotiates with the Lord. God's just nature. In response to Abraham's plea, God agrees that he would spare the entire city if he found 50 righteous individuals there. This reveals God's commitment to justice and his willingness to withhold judgment for the sake of a few righteous individuals. It shows that God is merciful and desires to save those who follow him. The nature of intercession. Abraham's intercession on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah teaches us about the power of prayer and the value of interceding for others. Abraham's willingness to stand in the gap and advocate for the righteous demonstrates his understanding of God's character and his desire to save. It encourages us to intercede for others, pleading for God's mercy and intervention in their lives. The principle of God's mercy. God's response to Abraham reveals his merciful nature. He is willing to spare the entire city for the sake of a few righteous individuals. This principle emphasizes that God's justice is tempered by His mercy. It reminds us that even in times of judgment, God seeks to save and deliver those who are faithful to Him. Application. Genesis chapter 18 verse 26 reminds us of the importance of righteousness and the impact it can have on a community. The righteous have the potential to bring about positive change and act as a source of God's mercy for others. It also highlights the responsibility of believers to intercede for those who are lost or living in sin, recognizing the power of prayer and the potential for God's mercy to be extended through our petitions. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 18 verse 26 teaches us about the righteous character of Abraham, the just nature of God, the power of intercession, and the principle of God's mercy. It reminds us of the importance of righteousness and encourages us to intercede for others, trusting in God's willingness to spare and save those who seek Him. Genesis chapter 18 verse 27. And Abraham answered and said, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. In this verse, Abraham is engaged in a conversation with the Lord before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's delve into the context and explore the significance of Abraham's words. The encounter between Abraham and the Lord begins earlier in Genesis chapter 18 when three men, who are actually angels, visit Abraham's tent. Abraham warmly welcomes them and extends his hospitality, offering them food and rest. During their visit, the Lord reveals His plan to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their wickedness. Abraham, being concerned for the righteous people living in those cities, intercedes on their behalf. He begins a series of negotiations with the Lord, pleading for mercy and questioning the extent of God's justice. It is during this dialogue that Abraham humbly expresses his unworthiness and insignificance in the presence of the Lord. Abraham's statement, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes, is an acknowledgement of his own mortality and human frailty. By referring to himself as dust and ashes, Abraham recognizes his humble origin and his awareness of his limited understanding and authority in comparison to the divine. This declaration reveals several important aspects of Abraham's character. First, it showcases his boldness and intimacy in conversing with God. He addresses the Lord directly, putting forth his questions and concerns without fear or hesitation. Abraham's confidence stems from his close relationship with God, built over time through faith and obedience. Second, Abraham's humility shines through his words. He acknowledges his finite nature, emphasizing his unworthiness to question God's plans or to plead on behalf of others. This humble attitude demonstrates his reverence for God's sovereignty and wisdom. Lastly, Abraham's plea serves as an example of intercessory prayer and God's responsiveness to it. Despite Abraham's recognition of his own unworthiness, the Lord listens to his petitions and engages in a compassionate dialogue with him. This interaction highlights God's willingness to consider the righteous person's request and His mercy in response to genuine intercession. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 27 captures Abraham's humility, faith, and his relationship with the Lord. It reminds us of the importance of approaching God with reverence and humility, recognizing our own limitations while maintaining a boldness in seeking His mercy and grace. Genesis chapter 18 verse 28. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, If I find there 40 and 5, I will not destroy it. This verse is part of the account where Abraham intercedes with God on behalf of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, pleading for their salvation. Let's explore the context and meaning of this verse. In Genesis chapter 18, we find that 3 men, who are actually divine beings or angels, visit Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. Abraham extends generous hospitality to them, and during their conversation, the Lord reveals that He intends to investigate the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great wickedness. Abraham, being concerned for his nephew Lot and the righteous people in those cities, begins a dialogue with the Lord to intercede for them. In the preceding verses, Abraham progressively lowers the number of righteous people necessary for God to spare the cities. He starts with 50 and gradually decreases it. In Genesis chapter 18 verse 28, Abraham proposes the question to God, saying, "Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? Abraham's question reflects his concern for the fate of the entire city if there were only 45 righteous individuals instead of 50. In response to Abraham's query, God replies, "If I find there 40 and 5, I will not destroy it." God assures Abraham that if there are 45 righteous people found within Sodom and Gomorrah, he will spare the cities from destruction. This passage reveals both Abraham's boldness in approaching God and his deep concern for the welfare of others. Abraham's intercession on behalf of the cities demonstrates his compassion and desire for justice tempered with mercy. He pleads with God, seeking to understand the extent of his justice and his willingness to show mercy. Genesis chapter 18 verse 28 teaches us important lessons about the nature of God and the importance of intercession. It shows that God is just and desires righteousness, but he is also open to listening to the pleas of his people and responding with mercy. Additionally, this passage reminds us of the significance of interceding for others. Abraham's intercession serves as an example for us to pray for others and appeal to God on their behalf, particularly when we see situations where justice and mercy need to be balanced. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 28 captures Abraham's plea to God, asking if he would spare the city of Sodom and Gomorrah if there were only 45 righteous individuals found there. God responds affirmatively, revealing his willingness to show mercy and the importance of intercession in seeking God's justice and mercy for others. Genesis chapter 18 verse 29. And he spake unto him yet again, and said, Peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. This verse is part of the narrative in Genesis where the Lord appeared to Abraham and informed him of the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great wickedness. Abraham, concerned for the righteous people who might reside there, intercedes on their behalf and engages in a dialogue with the Lord. In this particular verse, Abraham continues to negotiate with God, expressing his concern about the fate of the cities. He proposes the possibility that there might be 40 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he asks if God would still proceed with the destruction if that were the case. God responds, saying that he would not destroy the cities for the sake of 40 righteous people. This verse highlights an important aspect of Abraham's character and his relationship with God. Abraham's intercession for the cities demonstrates his compassion, mercy, and concern for the welfare of others. It reveals his willingness to advocate for justice and righteousness, even in the face of imminent judgment. Abraham's negotiation with God also highlights the nature of God's justice and mercy. God is portrayed as a fair and just judge who listens to the pleas of his faithful servant. He engages in a back-and-forth conversation with Abraham, patiently considering each proposal and responding accordingly. This interaction demonstrates that God is not only just, but also open to dialogue and willing to show mercy. Through this passage, we can learn several important lessons. First, it teaches us the significance of interceding for others and the power of prayer. Abraham's intercession had the potential to save an entire city if a sufficient number of righteous people were found within it. It reminds us of the importance of lifting up our concerns and the needs of others to God in prayer. Second, this verse reveals God's willingness to hear and respond to our prayers. It demonstrates his mercy and compassion, as he engages in a dialogue with Abraham and considers his petitions. It encourages us to approach God with confidence, knowing that he is attentive to our requests and desires to show mercy and grace. Finally, this verse underscores the importance of righteousness and the impact it can have on a community. Abraham's negotiations with God revolve around the presence of righteous individuals in Sodom and Gomorrah. It reminds us of the value of living a righteous life and the positive influence it can have on those around us. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 18 verse 29 provides us with insights into the character of Abraham, the nature of God's justice and mercy, and the power of intercessory prayer. It encourages us to pray for others, approach God with our concerns, and strive to live righteous lives that positively impact our communities. Genesis chapter 18 verse 30, "And he said unto him, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak, peradventure there shall 30 be found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there." In this verse, Abraham is engaged in a conversation with the Lord, who has appeared to him in the form of 3 men. Abraham is aware that God is planning to judge the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah and is concerned about the fate of the righteous people living in those cities, particularly his nephew Lot. The verse begins with Abraham pleading with God not to be angry, demonstrating his humility and reverence. He proposes a scenario to the Lord, saying, "Peradventure there shall 30 be found there." Abraham suggests that if there are at least 30 righteous people in Sodom, would God spare the city? God responds to Abraham's proposal by stating, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." God's reply indicates that if there are not at least 30 righteous individuals in Sodom, he will not withhold his judgment upon the city. This passage highlights several important aspects of Abraham's character and his relationship with God. First, Abraham displays his boldness and faith by engaging in a dialogue with God, interceding for the righteous. Abraham's willingness to negotiate with God on behalf of others demonstrates his deep concern and compassion for those who may be righteous in Sodom. Second, we witness Abraham's understanding of God's justice. Abraham recognizes that God is a righteous judge who will not spare the wicked indefinitely. He acknowledges the need for righteous people to exist in order to warrant God's mercy and deliverance. Furthermore, this verse emphasizes the importance of intercessory prayer. Abraham's actions serve as an example of interceding on behalf of others before God, pleading for mercy and seeking his favor. Overall, Genesis chapter 18 verse 30 showcases Abraham's courage, faith, and concern for the righteous. It reminds us of the significance of intercession and underscores the importance of righteousness in the eyes of God's judgment. This verse also prompts us to reflect on our own responsibility to pray for others and to live in righteousness before God. Genesis chapter 18 verse 31. "And he said, Behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake." In this verse, Abraham is engaged in a conversation with the Lord. Prior to this, Abraham had been interceding for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, where his nephew Lot resided. The Lord had revealed his plans to destroy these cities due to their great wickedness. Abraham, filled with compassion for his family and the inhabitants of the cities, begins a dialogue with God. He presents a series of inquiries to God, seeking to understand his judgment and mercy. In this particular verse, Abraham proposes to the Lord that if 20 righteous people were found within the cities, would he spare them from destruction? Abraham's plea is a remarkable demonstration of his concern for the well-being of the righteous and his desire to see God's mercy and justice intertwined. He starts with a higher number, gradually reducing it to see if God's mercy would extend to sparing the cities for the sake of a relatively small number of righteous individuals. In response to Abraham's plea, the Lord agrees not to destroy the cities if 20 righteous individuals are found within them. This interaction illustrates God's willingness to listen to the prayers and petitions of his faithful servants and to consider their pleas for mercy. Abraham's dialogue with God showcases his remarkable faith, humility, and intercessory nature. He boldly approaches the Lord, presenting his case with reverence and persistence, seeking to understand God's character and the extent of his mercy. Through this exchange, Abraham reveals his deep trust in God's righteousness and fairness. Genesis chapter 18 verse 31 serves as a reminder of the importance of prayer and intercession. It shows that God is attentive to the cries of His people and that He responds to their pleas for mercy. Furthermore, it highlights the significance of faith and trust in our relationship with God, as Abraham's faith enabled him to approach the Lord with boldness and seek His divine intervention. Overall, this verse in Genesis chapter 18 verse 31 encourages believers to approach God with humility, trust, and a heart of intercession, knowing that He is a merciful and just God who hears and responds to the prayers of His people. Genesis chapter 18 verse 32. And he said, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once, peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. This verse is part of the narrative of Abraham's intercession for the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this passage, Abraham is engaged in a dialogue with the Lord, who has revealed His plan to destroy the cities due to their great wickedness. Abraham, recognizing the seriousness of the situation, appeals to God's mercy and justice, seeking to spare the cities if a certain number of righteous people can be found within them. The significance of this verse lies in the concept of intercession and the nature of God's justice and mercy. Abraham pleads with God to withhold His judgment if there are at least 10 righteous individuals in Sodom and Gomorrah. The number 10 seems to be a significant threshold, suggesting that even a small remnant of righteous people can have a powerful impact on the outcome. Abraham's intercession highlights several important aspects of his character and his relationship with God. First, it demonstrates his deep concern for the well-being of others, even for those who are wicked. Abraham displays compassion and a desire for the salvation of others, going so far as to question and negotiate with the Lord Himself. Second, this passage reveals God's willingness to engage in dialogue and respond to the appeals of His faithful servants. The Lord listens to Abraham's plea and agrees to spare the cities if the condition of finding 10 righteous individuals is met. This interaction underscores the importance of communication and relationship in our dealings with God. Additionally, this passage reflects God's balance of justice and mercy. Although Sodom and Gomorrah were exceedingly wicked, God is open to the possibility of sparing them for the sake of the righteous. It highlights God's desire for repentance and salvation rather than immediate destruction. Ultimately, however, Sodom and Gomorrah did not have even 10 righteous individuals, and God's judgment was carried out. This outcome serves as a reminder of the seriousness of sin and the consequences that follow when a society turns away from God. In summary, Genesis chapter 18 verse 32 showcases Abraham's intercession, God's willingness to listen and respond, and the balance of justice and mercy. It teaches us the value of compassion for others, the importance of communication with God, and the sobering reality of the consequences of sin. Genesis chapter 18 verse 33, And the Lord went His way, as soon as He had left communing with Abraham, and Abraham returned unto his place. This verse concludes the account of Abraham's conversation with the Lord regarding the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. To understand the significance of Genesis chapter 18 verse 33, it's essential to examine the context and the events leading up to this verse. In Genesis chapter 18, 3 visitors, who are later revealed to be angels, appear to Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. Abraham, recognizing their divine nature, shows great hospitality and prepares a meal for them. During their visit, the Lord reveals to Abraham His plans to investigate the wickedness in Sodom and Gomorrah and subsequently bring judgment upon the cities. Abraham, displaying his concern for the righteous individuals living in those cities, engages in a remarkable dialogue with the Lord. In a series of conversations, Abraham repeatedly intercedes on behalf of the righteous, seeking to spare the cities from destruction. He starts by asking if the Lord would spare the cities if there were 50 righteous people within them, and the Lord agrees. Abraham continues to decrease the number, asking if there were 45, 40, 30, 20, or even 10 righteous people, would the Lord still destroy the cities? Each time, the Lord agrees not to destroy the cities for the sake of the righteous. Genesis chapter 18 verse 33 serves as a conclusion to this conversation. After the intense intercession and dialogue, the Lord, having finished communing with Abraham, departs, and Abraham returns to his place. This verse signifies the completion of their interaction. The significance of this passage lies in the demonstration of Abraham's faith and his boldness in approaching the Lord to plead for mercy and justice. Abraham's intercession reveals his deep concern for the righteous and his desire to see justice tempered with mercy. His willingness to engage in this dialogue shows his intimate relationship with God and his understanding of God's character and attributes. Additionally, this passage highlights the Lord's patience and willingness to engage in a conversation with Abraham. It demonstrates that God is open to hearing the petitions of his people and can be moved by their prayers. Although the cities ultimately face destruction, this dialogue reveals God's mercy and willingness to spare the wicked for the sake of the righteous. In a broader theological sense, this passage emphasizes the importance of intercession and the role it can play in the interaction between God and humanity. It encourages believers to approach God with confidence, knowing that He hears their prayers and is willing to engage in a dialogue with them. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 18 verse 33 concludes the conversation between the Lord and Abraham regarding the impending destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It highlights Abraham's faith, boldness, and concern for the righteous, as well as God's patience and willingness to engage in dialogue with His people. This passage serves as a reminder of the significance of intercession and the power of prayer in our relationship with God.